Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your modern dating drama look like kindergarten playground squabbles. How medieval law dealt with extramarital affairs. You know, back when getting caught cheating could literally end with you drowning in a river, or having your nose sliced off in the town square. Picture yourself standing in the dusty streets of ancient Babylon, around 1750 BCE, watching as a crowd gathers around two figures being dragged toward the Euphrates River. The woman's hands are bound behind her back, her lover stumbling beside her, both about to face Hammurabi's idea of justice. You can almost taste the tension in the air, mixed with that particular scent of river mud and impending doom that seems to follow ancient legal proceedings. Now, before we get too comfortable imagining these medieval soap opera moments, here's a reality check that you probably won't survive. If you lived back then, statistics suggest you'd witness at least 3 public adultery punishments before your 20th birthday, assuming you made it that far past all the plagues, wars, and questionable medical practices involving leeches. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location, and what time you're listening to this. I love seeing where in the world people are getting sleepy with medieval legal history. And here's a fun challenge. There's going to be a quiz question about halfway through tonight's journey, so if you're still awake in about 30 minutes, prove it by commenting your answer. Speaking of getting high on history, isn't it fascinating how we get our kicks from true crime podcasts and reality TV drama, while our ancestors got their entertainment from watching actual legal proceedings that could end in someone's literal demise? Same human curiosity, wildly different stakes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're transported back to ancient Mesopotamia, where the world's first written legal code is about to change everything. Hammurabi, king of Babylon, has just finished carving 282 laws into a massive black stone pillar, and law number 129 is about to become the template for how civilizations handle cheating spouses for millennia to come. The law is brutally simple. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and cast them into the water. But here's where it gets interesting. You discover there are loopholes that would make modern lawyers weep with envy. If the husband decides to spare his wife, then the king must spare her lover. It's like an ancient legal 2-for-1 deal, except the merchandise is human lives. You watch as a Babylonian wife named Ninhursag stands before the local tribunal, accused by her merchant husband of entertaining a young temple scribe while he was away trading cedar wood. The evidence? A neighbor claims to have seen the scribe leaving her house at dawn, carrying his sandals. In Babylonian court, that's practically a smoking gun. But here's the quirky detail that historians love to debate. Some clay tablets suggest that wealthy families could pay a river tax to have the drowning performed in shallow water, essentially turning a death sentence into an extremely unpleasant baptism. Historians still argue whether this was official policy or just creative corruption among local officials. The crowd around you murmurs as Ninhursag's husband approaches the judge. In a twist that would make soap opera writers jealous, he declares his intention to forgive his wife. The scribe, who moments before was mentally composing his last prayers to Marduk, suddenly finds himself free to walk away, probably with a lifelong commitment to celibacy. You realize you're witnessing the birth of legal precedent, the idea that laws need written rules because human nature is predictably unpredictable. One husband wants blood, another wants reconciliation, but society needs consistency. Hammurabi's solution is characteristically Mesopotamian. When in doubt, threaten everyone with drowning, then let individual conscience sort out the details. The stone pillar beside you, standing nearly 8 feet tall and covered in cuneiform script, represents humanity's first attempt to standardize justice. But as you'll soon discover, every civilization that follows will take these basic principles and twist them into increasingly elaborate and sometimes bizarre legal frameworks that reflect their own cultural obsessions and moral panics. You find yourself transported forward several centuries to Rome, around 100 CE, where the empire has turned adultery prosecution into something resembling a twisted game show, complete with Senate oversight and dramatic family confrontations that would make reality TV producers jealous. The morning sun reflects off the marble columns of a wealthy Roman villa as you witness Marcus Aurelius Bruttianus discovering his wife Livia, in what Romans delicately call compromising circumstances, with a young gladiator trainer. The rage in Marcus's eyes tells you everything about Roman masculine honor, but the legal machinery about to unfold is far more complex than Hammurabi's simple drowning solution. Under the Lex Iulia de Adulterius, passed by Augustus in 18 BCE, Roman law has created the world's first comprehensive adultery legislation. You watch as Marcus faces a choice that perfectly captures Roman legal sophistication. He can kill the lover immediately if caught in the act, but only under specific conditions that read like a legal textbook footnote. The lover must be a slave, freedman, or someone of significantly lower social status. Kill a fellow citizen, and Marcus himself faces murder charges. Here's where Roman law gets deliciously complicated. Marcus must divorce Livia within 60 days and prosecute her within the following 60 days, or he faces charges of pimping. Essentially, the law assumes any husband who doesn't prosecute is profiting from his wife's affairs. It's like being legally required to file for divorce or be labeled a criminal yourself. You observe as Marcus storms through his house, servants scattering like startled pigeons, while he mentally calculates the social mathematics. Livia comes from a powerful senatorial family, whose political support he needs for his upcoming bid for praetor. The gladiator trainer, unfortunately for him, is a former slave whose freedom makes him legally killable under the caught in the act provisions. But here's the quirky detail that makes Roman legal scholars scratch their heads. Some graffiti found in Pompeii suggests that wealthy Romans occasionally hired actors to stage fake adultery scenes to trigger divorce proceedings without the social stigma of abandoning a marriage. Historians still argue whether these were elaborate pranks, legal strategies, or evidence of the world's first divorce attorneys getting creative with loopholes. The gladiator trainer, realizing his precarious position, does what any sensible person facing Roman justice would do. He flees to the nearest temple and claims sanctuary. Unfortunately, adultery isn't considered a religious offense, so the priests basically shrug and wish him luck outrunning an angry Roman husband with legal murder privileges. You follow Marcus as he visits his father-in-law, Senator Gaius Flavius, whose political calculation skills would impress modern campaign managers. Flavius points out that prosecuting Livia publicly would shame both families, potentially ending Marcus's political career and damaging the senator's own standing. Instead, he suggests a private divorce with a carefully constructed story about irreconcilable differences. Roman code for, "We're covering up something scandalous." The genius of Roman adultery law lies in its public nature. Unlike Babylonian drowning, which was quick if brutal, Roman prosecutions became public spectacles held in special courts called quaestio de adulteriis. You realize you're watching the birth of celebrity scandal culture. Roman citizens would actually attend these trials as entertainment, complete with betting on outcomes and detailed gossip networks that spread faster than official news. Livia's fate depends on factors that would seem absurd today. Her father's political connections, her dowry amount, Marcus's career ambitions, and even the current emperor's mood regarding marriage legislation. If convicted, she faces exile to a barren island, loss of half her dowry, and a lifetime ban on remarriage to anyone above freedman status. Basically, Roman social death. The gladiator trainer, meanwhile, has discovered that Roman law contains a bizarre provision allowing him to claim that Livia seduced him through magic spells, essentially pleading temporary insanity by witchcraft. It's a desperate strategy that occasionally worked, particularly if the accused could afford a rhetorician skilled in supernatural legal arguments. As you watch this drama unfold across weeks of legal maneuvering, you realize Roman adultery law serves multiple purposes beyond moral enforcement. It's a tool for political warfare, economic manipulation, and social control that makes medieval systems look almost quaint by comparison. You're suddenly swept northward to a windswept Viking settlement in 9th century Norway, where the aurora borealis dances overhead, and the approach to adultery justice is about to make Roman legal complexity look like child's play. The longhouse before you echoes with heated voices as the community gathers for what they call a thing, a legal assembly that's part courtroom, part theater, and part gladiatorial arena. Bjorn the ironsmith stands in the center of the circle, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he accuses his neighbor Eric Bloodaxe of seducing his wife Astrid while Bjorn was away raiding in Ireland. The accusation hangs in the cold air like frost, and you can sense the entire community's anticipation. This isn't just about marriage. It's about honor, reputation, and the intricate social bonds that keep their harsh world functioning. Norse law operates on a principle that would terrify modern mediators: public shaming as performance art. You watch as the law speaker, an elderly man whose memory contains the entire legal code since writing is still rare, begins reciting the procedures for adultery accusations. Unlike Romans with their written statutes, Vikings rely on oral tradition, which means every legal proceeding becomes a kind of epic poem with life or death consequences. The first option available to Bjorn is the holmgang, a ritualized duel that turns legal disputes into literal fights to the death. You observe as Eric, who's built like a bear and carries a sword named Widowmaker, actually looks nervous. See, holmgang isn't just about physical strength. It's believed that the gods will ensure the innocent party wins, which means losing doesn't just mean death. It means divine judgment against your character. But here's where Viking justice gets cleverly practical. Bjorn can choose to demand compensation instead of combat. The law speaker announces that adultery requires payment of full man price, the same amount you'd pay for killing someone. It's like treating adultery as social murder, which actually makes twisted sense in a society where reputation determines survival. Here's the quirky detail that makes anthropologists grin. Some sagas describe elaborate adultery investigations involving community members hiding in hay lofts, following suspicious parties through forests, and even employing what amounts to medieval private detectives. One saga mentions a woman named Gudrun who trained her pet raven to follow her husband and report back his activities, though historians still argue whether this represents actual practice or just storyteller creativity. You witness Astrid herself step forward, invoking her right to defend herself through what Vikings call oath-helping. She must find 12 respectable community members willing to swear she's telling the truth about her innocence. In a settlement of maybe 60 adults, this means convincing a fifth of your neighbors to risk their own reputations on your honesty. It's like medieval Yelp reviews, except the stakes are banishment or death. The tension escalates when Eric suggests trial by ordeal. Specifically, the hot iron test where Astrid would have to carry a red-hot piece of metal for several steps and allow a priest to examine her hands 3 days later. Clean healing means innocence. Infection means guilt and punishment. You realize you're watching people literally betting their lives on their immune systems and wound-healing abilities. But the most fascinating aspect of Viking adultery law emerges when the law speaker explains the concept of NID, a form of ritual cursing that can be worse than physical punishment. If found guilty, the adulterous couple faces public composition of insulting verses that will be recited at every feast and gathering for generations. Imagine having your worst life choices immortalized in folk songs that your great-grandchildren will still be hearing. The proceeding takes an unexpected turn when old Ingvar the Wise points out that Bjorn's accusation lacks proper witnesses. Apparently, seeing someone enter a house isn't enough. Viking law requires witnesses to the actual deed, which creates the obvious problem of who exactly is going to volunteer for that particular viewing experience. As the debate continues into the night, you realize Viking adultery proceedings serve as community bonding exercises. Everyone gets to participate in the investigation, offer opinions, cite precedents from other cases, and generally engage in the kind of collaborative problem-solving that keeps isolated settlements functioning through brutal winters and constant external threats. The case of Bjorn, Astrid, and Eric will likely end with a complex negotiation involving compensation payments, public apologies, temporary exile, and possibly a marriage rearrangement that satisfies everyone's honor while maintaining community stability. Medieval conflict resolution that would impress modern therapists. Quiz time. Here's your question. According to what we've learned so far, which ancient civilization allowed a husband to legally spare his adulterous wife, which would then automatically spare her lover as well? Comment your answer if you're still awake. You find yourself standing in the shadowed halls of a medieval monastery around 1150 CE, where the smell of parchment and incense mingles with the weight of theological revolution. The Christian Church has decided that adultery isn't just a legal matter. It's a cosmic battle between good and evil that requires an entirely new framework of earthly justice backed by divine authority. Brother Augustine scratches away at his manuscript by candlelight, codifying what will become canon law, while you witness the Church's brilliant power grab disguised as spiritual guidance. They've taken the relatively straightforward civil matter of marital betrayal and transformed it into a complex system that gives them jurisdiction over nearly every aspect of human relationships. The genius of the Church's approach lies in redefining marriage itself. You watch as a young priest explains to a confused peasant couple that marriage isn't just a contract between families. It's now a sacrament blessed by God, which means adultery becomes not just a crime against your spouse, but a sin against the divine order of creation itself. It's like upgrading a parking ticket to treason. Here's where medieval Christianity gets deliciously complex. The Church creates an entire hierarchy of sexual sins that would make modern taxonomists proud. Adultery ranks differently depending on whether you're married, single, a priest, a nun, or various combinations thereof. You observe monks debating whether a married man sleeping with a single woman commits the same level of sin as a single man sleeping with a married woman. Theological mathematics that could determine someone's eternal fate. The practical implications become clear as you follow a case in 12th century France. Dame Marguerite, wife of a minor lord, stands accused of adultery with her husband's chaplain, a scenario that combines several categories of sin into what canon lawyers call a compound transgression. The church court must navigate adultery, clerical celibacy violations, and the added complexity that the affair allegedly took place in the castle's chapel, making it sacrilege as well. But here's the quirky detail that makes church historians chuckle. Medieval canon law develops an elaborate system of penances that essentially allows wealthy sinners to buy their way out of punishment through charitable donations. A peasant caught in adultery might face years of public humiliation and exclusion from sacraments, while a noble could endow a monastery and be spiritually cleansed by Christmas. It's medieval indulgences applied to marriage counseling. You witness the Church's investigation methods, which blend spiritual authority with surprisingly sophisticated detective work. Church courts employ sworn investigators who interview neighbors, examine bedding for evidence, and even consult with local wise women about pregnancy timing to establish paternity. Historians still argue whether these investigations were genuinely seeking truth or simply gathering enough evidence to support predetermined political outcomes. The punishment system reveals the Church's understanding of psychology centuries before Freud. Instead of Roman-style execution or Viking compensation, canon law emphasizes public confession, ritual humiliation, and spiritual rehabilitation. You watch as Dame Marguerite is sentenced to walk barefoot around the cathedral every Sunday for a year, wearing sackcloth and carrying a candle, while publicly reciting her sins to anyone who will listen. The chaplain faces even more creative consequences. He's defrocked, banned from celebrating Mass, and assigned to a remote monastery where he'll spend 5 years copying penitential psalms. But here's the twist that shows church pragmatism. If he demonstrates genuine repentance and his noble patron intercedes, he might eventually return to service in a different diocese. It's like medieval witness protection for sinful priests. Canon law creates fascinating paradoxes around evidence and proof. The Church requires either confession or 2 credible witnesses to the actual adultery, but then defines credible in ways that exclude women, servants, and anyone with a personal grudge, essentially making conviction nearly impossible unless someone voluntarily confesses or gets spectacularly careless about their affairs. You realize the Church's real innovation lies in separating spiritual consequences from civil punishment. A couple might face excommunication and public penance from church courts while simultaneously dealing with property disputes, child custody questions, and inheritance issues in secular courts. It's like having 2 different legal systems prosecuting the same crime with completely different rules and penalties. The most brilliant aspect of ecclesiastical adultery law emerges in its treatment of marriage itself. By making marriage indissoluble except under extraordinary circumstances, the Church forces couples to seek annulments rather than divorces, a process that requires proving the marriage was never valid to begin with. This creates a thriving industry of canon lawyers who specialize in finding creative reasons why obviously legitimate marriages were actually spiritually invalid from the start. As you observe these medieval legal proceedings, you notice how the Church uses adultery cases to reinforce broader social hierarchies while simultaneously claiming to serve divine justice, creating a system that's both spiritually sophisticated and politically ruthless. You find yourself in the opulent court of 12th century France, where tapestries depict romantic knights and fair ladies, while the actual legal reality of adultery creates a contradiction, so stark it would give modern philosophers whiplash. The air is thick with rose water and political intrigue, as you witness how French aristocracy has managed to romanticize extramarital affairs in poetry, while simultaneously creating some of medieval Europe's most brutal punishments for actually engaging in them. Eleanor of Aquitaine glides past you in silk and ermine, her court filled with troubadours singing of courtly love, that peculiar medieval invention where knights pledge eternal devotion to married noblewomen they're theoretically never supposed to touch. You realize you're watching the birth of romantic literature and the simultaneous criminalization of its actual practice, a cultural schizophrenia that defines French medieval society. The legal proceedings you observe reveal how French courts have adapted Roman law with distinctly Gallic creativity. Count Guillaume stands accused of adultery with the wife of his vassal, Baron Henri, and the case demonstrates how French law treats adultery as both a crime against marriage and a violation of feudal loyalty. It's like being prosecuted for both theft and treason simultaneously, with penalties that stack rather than overlap. French customary law, which varies dramatically between regions, creates a patchwork of adultery prosecution that would confuse modern lawyers. In Normandy, you watch as an adulterous wife can be imprisoned in her husband's castle tower for life, literally becoming a prisoner in her own home. In Brittany, the same offense might result in public flogging, followed by banishment to a convent, where she'll spend her remaining years copying religious manuscripts and contemplating her sins. Here's where French adultery law gets entertainingly vindictive. The legal concept of mort civile, or civil death, where convicted adulterers lose all legal rights while remaining physically alive. You observe as Lady Isabel, caught in flagranti with a traveling minstrel, watches helplessly as her property transfers to her husband, her children are declared orphans, and her very existence becomes legally invisible. She's essentially been erased from society, without the inconvenience of actual execution. But here's the quirky detail that makes French legal historians grin. Some regions develop trial by combat for women, where accused wives can choose champions to fight on their behalf. You witness the bizarre spectacle of armored knights battling over whether Lady Margot actually kissed the stable master behind the dovecot. The theological logic suggests God will ensure the innocent party's champion wins, but the practical result often depends more on which knight had better training and less alcohol the night before. The troubadour culture creates particular legal complications that French courts struggle to address. When Count Bernard commissions love songs about his neighbor's wife, is that adultery of the heart requiring punishment, or just expensive poetry requiring payment? You watch as legal scholars debate whether romantic verse constitutes evidence of actual adultery, or merely demonstrates the flourishing of French cultural sophistication. Historians still argue whether the famous courts of love actually existed or were literary inventions. But the legal records show real French courts wrestling with questions like whether a knight who carries his lady's favor into battle while she's married to someone else has committed a prosecutable offense. It's medieval intellectual property law applied to emotional relationships. The French developed particularly creative approaches to evidence gathering that would horrify modern privacy advocates. Court investigators employ what they call chamberwomen testimony, where female servants are legally required to report suspicious activity in their mistress's bedchambers. You realize you're watching the institutionalization of domestic espionage, where household staff become reluctant prosecutors of their own employers. The punishment creativity reaches artistic levels in French courts. Beyond simple execution or imprisonment, you observe sentences that include having love letters publicly read in the town square, forced marriage to social inferiors, and ritual destruction of romantic gifts in public ceremonies. One particularly vindictive judge sentences an adulterous couple to be chained together and paraded through every market town between Paris and Rouen. Medieval public shaming as performance art. French law also creates the fascinating concept of adultery by proxy, where nobles can be prosecuted for affairs conducted by their representatives or household members. When Duke Robert's secretary seduces Baron Michel's wife while conducting diplomatic negotiations, both the secretary and the duke face charges, essentially treating adultery as a form of political warfare requiring collective responsibility. The most sophisticated aspect of French adultery prosecution emerges in its treatment of noble marriages as political alliances. You watch as adultery cases become proxy battles between rival noble houses, with accusations and counter-accusations flying like arrows in a siege. The affair itself becomes almost secondary to the larger political implications of who's allied with whom, and what territories might change hands depending on the verdict. As you observe these proceedings, you realize French medieval law has created a system where romantic love is simultaneously celebrated and criminalized, where poetry and prosecution coexist in courts that blur the lines between legal justice and political theater. You find yourself standing in the muddy courtyard of an Anglo-Saxon manor house around 950 CE, just as English law is about to undergo one of history's most dramatic legal transplants. The Norman conquest is still a century away, but you can already sense the tension between ancient Germanic traditions and the Roman-influenced legal systems that will soon collide like medieval tectonic plates. Before you, Aldrich the blacksmith faces the local 100 court, accused of seducing Edith, wife of Wulfstan the miller, while her husband was away collecting grain taxes for the local thane. Under Anglo-Saxon law, this isn't just a marital dispute. It's a violation of the complex web of kinship obligations, property rights, and social bonds that keep early English communities functioning in a world where central authority barely exists. The Anglo-Saxon approach to adultery reveals a society obsessed with compensation rather than punishment. You watch as the court's law speaker calculates the wergild, literally man price, that Aldrich must pay to restore social harmony. But here's where it gets deliciously complex. He owes different amounts to different people. Wulfstan gets compensation for the insult to his honor. Edith's father receives payment for the damage to his family's reputation. And even the local community demands a fine for the disruption to social order. The calculation resembles medieval actuarial science. Edith's value gets assessed based on her social status, her father's wealth, her proven fertility, she has 3 children, her domestic skills, and even her reputation for piety. You realize you're watching human worth being reduced to mathematical formulas that would make modern insurance adjusters proud. An earl's wife might be worth 60 times more than a peasant woman, creating a sliding scale of justice based entirely on social hierarchy. But here's the quirky detail that makes Anglo-Saxon legal scholars scratch their heads. Some court records mention reputation auctions, where accused adulterers could bid against each other for the right to be considered the less guilty party. If 2 men were accused of affairs with the same woman, they might literally compete to see who could pay more for the privilege of being labeled the victim rather than the primary offender. Historians still argue whether this represents actual legal practice or just creative record-keeping by board scribes. The Norman conquest of 1066 transforms everything you've just witnessed into a legal archaeology project. William the Conqueror arrives with Roman-trained legal scholars who look at Anglo-Saxon compensation culture like anthropologists studying a fascinating but primitive tribe. You watch as Norman administrators begin systematically replacing Germanic customs with continental legal procedures that emphasize royal authority over community consensus. The transition period creates legal chaos that would fascinate modern constitutional lawyers. Norman courts want written evidence and formal procedures. Anglo-Saxon tradition relies on oral testimony and community knowledge. When Godwin the Weaver is accused of adultery in 1075, 9 years after the conquest, his case gets tried under 3 different legal systems simultaneously: Anglo-Saxon custom, Norman civil law, and increasingly influential canon law from the Church. The Norman innovation that revolutionizes English adultery law is the concept of royal jurisdiction. Under Anglo-Saxon tradition, adultery was a community matter resolved through local compensation. Norman law makes it a crime against the king's peace, essentially nationalizing marital disputes. You realize you're witnessing the birth of centralized legal authority, where personal relationships become matters of state interest. Henry II's legal reforms in the 1160s create what historians call the Great Systematization, the transformation of chaotic local customs into standardized royal procedures. The new system introduces professional judges, written records, and appeals processes that turn adultery prosecution into something resembling modern litigation. But it also creates new opportunities for corruption, delay, and legal manipulation that didn't exist under the simpler Anglo-Saxon system. The evolution of English adultery law reveals broader tensions about royal power versus local autonomy. Norman kings want consistent legal procedures across their territories, but English communities resist losing their traditional rights to resolve disputes through customary methods. You observe court cases where the same adultery might be prosecuted under royal law, ecclesiastical law, and local custom, with completely different outcomes depending on which court gains jurisdiction first. English common law's treatment of adultery evidence shows remarkable sophistication for its time. Unlike continental systems that rely heavily on confession or witness testimony, English courts begin developing rules about circumstantial evidence, hearsay, and the credibility of different types of witnesses. You watch as judges wrestle with questions like whether a woman's testimony about her own adultery should be trusted, or whether servants can testify against their masters. The most innovative aspect of English legal development emerges in its treatment of adultery as both a private wrong requiring compensation and a public crime requiring punishment. This dual nature creates complex legal procedures where the same act might result in both civil damages to the injured spouse and criminal penalties imposed by royal courts, essentially being sued and prosecuted simultaneously for the same behavior. You find yourself in a smoky Germanic longhouse around 800 CE, where the Frankish tribes are developing legal systems that will influence European law for centuries. The fire crackles in the center of the hall as tribal elders gather to resolve what they consider one of the most serious threats to community stability: adultery that disrupts the carefully maintained honor networks holding their warrior society together. Before the assembled crowd stands Gunther the Bold, his scarred hands trembling not from fear but from rage, as he accuses his blood brother Siegfried of violating the sacred trust of kinship by seducing his wife Brunhild while Gunther was away fighting the Saxons. You're witnessing more than a marital dispute. This is a crisis that could split the entire tribe and leave them vulnerable to external enemies who prey on divided communities. Germanic law operates on principles that would seem alien to Roman legal minds, but make perfect sense in a society where survival depends on intricate networks of mutual obligation. The concept of SIP, extended kinship groups responsible for each member's actions, means Siegfried's alleged adultery implicates not just him but his entire family line. You watch as his father, brothers, and even distant cousins face potential consequences for his individual transgression. The tribal assembly begins with ritual procedures that transform legal proceedings into religious ceremonies. The law speaker invokes the God's witness, participants swear oaths on sacred weapons, and the very act of accusation becomes a spiritual challenge to divine justice. You realize you're observing law as theater, where the proceedings themselves serve to reinforce community bonds and cosmic order. Germanic compensation culture creates a sophisticated system of graduated payments that would impress modern mediators. Rather than simple punishment, the tribe seeks Wergild calculations that restore social balance through carefully calibrated exchanges of value. Siegfried must compensate not only Gunther for the personal insult, but also Brunhild's birth family for the damage to their honor, the tribe for social disruption, and even the gods through ritual offerings. Here's where Germanic legal creativity gets fascinatingly complex. The tribe recognizes different categories of adultery based on the social relationships involved. Adultery between blood brothers carries higher penalties than affairs between strangers, while violations involving shield brothers, warriors sworn to die for each other, require special ritual procedures to cleanse the spiritual pollution that threatens the entire warband's effectiveness in battle. But here's the quirky detail that makes ethnographers grin. Some Frankish legal codes describe elaborate innocence competitions, where accused adulterers could prove their virtue through displays of skill, strength, or supernatural favor. One surviving fragment mentions a woman accused of adultery who was required to walk barefoot across hot coals while balancing a pot of water on her head. Success demonstrated divine protection and thus innocence, while failure proved guilt worthy of severe punishment. You witness the Germanic innovation of collective oath-taking, where Siegfried can defend himself by gathering oath helpers, community members willing to swear to his character and innocence. But unlike simple character witnesses, oath helpers share legal responsibility for their testimony. If Siegfried is later proven guilty, his oath helpers face penalties for perjury that could include loss of legal standing, financial penalties, or even outlawry from the tribe. The proceedings reveal how Germanic tribes use adultery cases to reinforce broader social hierarchies and alliance networks. Gunther's accusation forces the entire community to choose sides, creating opportunities for rivals to settle old grievances and allies to demonstrate loyalty through public support. You realize you're watching politics disguised as legal procedure, where individual justice becomes secondary to community power dynamics. Germanic law's treatment of women in adultery cases shows surprising complexity for a warrior culture typically dismissed as primitive. While women lack independent legal standing, they can influence proceedings through their male relatives and sometimes directly challenge accusations through ritual procedures. Brunhild herself might choose trial by ordeal, champion combat, or even formal debate where her eloquence could sway community opinion. Historians still argue whether the Germanic concept of Friedlosigkeit, literally peacelessness, was commonly applied to adultery cases, but the legal principle reveals sophisticated thinking about social contracts and community membership. An adulterer declared peaceless loses all legal protection. Anyone can kill, rob, or abuse them without penalty, essentially turning them into human prey until they can restore their standing through compensation or exile. The most innovative aspect of Germanic adultery law lies in its flexibility and community involvement. Unlike Roman imperial decrees or ecclesiastical canon law, Germanic legal procedures adapt to specific circumstances and local needs. Each case becomes a negotiation where the community weighs individual transgression against collective stability, creating customized solutions that maintain social harmony while addressing legitimate grievances. The resolution of Gunther and Siegfried's case demonstrates Germanic legal wisdom in action. Rather than destroying valuable warriors through execution or permanent exile, the tribe creates an elaborate compensation scheme involving shared military service, ritual purification, and redistributed marriage alliances that actually strengthens community bonds while addressing the original offense. You find yourself transported to the bustling streets of 9th century Baghdad, where the call to prayer echoes off marble minarets while Islamic scholars are developing what will become one of history's most detailed and sophisticated legal frameworks for dealing with adultery. The golden age of Islamic jurisprudence is creating a system that combines divine revelation, scholarly interpretation, and practical governance in ways that would influence legal thinking across 3 continents. In the House of Wisdom, you observe a heated debate between four different schools of Islamic law: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, as they wrestle with a case that has all of Baghdad talking. Fatima, wife of a wealthy silk merchant, stands accused of adultery with a young poet who has been frequenting her husband's shop ostensibly to purchase writing materials but actually, according to neighbors, to compose verses about her eyes being darker than the night between the stars. Islamic law approaches adultery with a precision that would make Roman legal scholars envious. The Quran establishes the basic framework: adultery, zina, is a serious crime requiring either 4 male witnesses to the actual act or confession by the accused. But centuries of scholarly interpretation have created a system of jurisprudence that examines every conceivable aspect of evidence, procedure, and punishment with mathematical precision. The 4-witness requirement creates what Islamic legal scholars call divine mercy through procedural difficulty. You watch as the court struggles with testimony from 3 neighbors who claim they saw Fatima and the poet in compromising positions. But Islamic law requires 4 witnesses who actually observe penetration, a standard so specific and demanding that successful prosecution becomes nearly impossible unless someone confesses or gets spectacularly careless about privacy. Here's where Islamic legal thinking gets brilliantly nuanced. The schools of law debate whether witnesses must observe the adultery simultaneously or can testify to different occasions, whether women's testimony counts equally to men's in zina cases, and even whether witness testimony given at different times of day carries different weight. It's jurisprudential complexity that makes continental European legal systems look almost primitive by comparison. But here's the quirky detail that makes Islamic legal historians smile. Some classical texts describe cases where accused adulterers would actually argue about who seduced whom, with each party trying to convince the court they were the victim rather than the initiator. One famous case from 10th century Cordoba involved a man and woman who spent 3 days in court taking turns accusing each other of seduction, essentially competing for the right to be considered less guilty. The punishment structure reveals Islamic law's sophisticated understanding of social consequences. While the Quran prescribes stoning for married adulterers and flogging for unmarried fornicators, the practical application involves extensive preliminary procedures designed to encourage repentance and social rehabilitation rather than punishment. You observe as religious authorities spend weeks counseling Fatima and the poet separately, offering multiple opportunities for them to abandon their relationship and seek forgiveness without formal prosecution. Islamic courts develop elaborate investigation procedures that balance thorough fact-finding with respect for privacy. Judges can examine physical evidence, interview character witnesses, and even consider circumstantial evidence like unexplained gifts or suspicious meeting patterns. But they're forbidden from conducting searches or surveillance that would violate Islamic principles of personal dignity and household sanctity. The concept of tawbah, repentance, creates fascinating legal paradoxes around confession and punishment. A person who confesses to adultery demonstrates the spiritual awareness that might make punishment unnecessary, while someone who denies obvious guilt shows the moral blindness that might require correction. Islamic courts must balance divine justice with earthly mercy, creating case-by-case decisions that consider individual circumstances and community needs. You witness the Islamic innovation of had versus ta'zir punishments, divinely prescribed penalties versus discretionary corrections determined by judges. While adultery technically falls under had, fixed divine punishment, the evidentiary requirements are so stringent that most cases actually get resolved through ta'zir procedures that allow judges to impose appropriate penalties based on local circumstances and individual factors. Historians still argue whether the classical Islamic emphasis on confession and witness testimony was primarily theological or practical, but the system creates interesting incentives for community behavior. Neighbors who might rush to testify in other legal systems face religious obligations to protect privacy and encourage private resolution of marital disputes rather than public prosecution and punishment. The most sophisticated aspect of Islamic adultery law emerges in its treatment of evidence and proof. Unlike Germanic oath-taking or Norman royal investigation, Islamic courts develop rules about the reliability of different types of testimony, the weight of circumstantial evidence, and the spiritual state required for witnesses to give valid testimony. A witness who drinks wine, for example, cannot testify in had cases regardless of what they observed. The case of Fatima and the poet ultimately demonstrates Islamic legal wisdom. After extensive investigation reveals insufficient evidence for formal prosecution, the court arranges a private resolution involving the poet's departure from Baghdad, Fatima's temporary residence with her family for spiritual counsel, and her husband's agreement to a more attentive approach to marriage that addresses the underlying causes of marital discord. You find yourself standing in the center of a medieval legal earthquake around 1200 CE, where two competing judicial titans, the Catholic Church and secular royal courts, are locked in an epic power struggle over who gets to control the most intimate aspects of human behavior. The battlefield isn't fought with swords and siege engines, but with legal briefs, jurisdictional claims, and the kind of bureaucratic warfare that would make modern corporate lawyers weep with admiration. The drama unfolds before you in the case of Sir Robert de Montfort, a minor English baron caught in what medieval lawyers delicately call criminal conversation with Lady Eleanor, wife of his feudal overlord Earl William. This isn't just adultery. It's a jurisdictional nightmare that threatens to expose the fundamental contradictions between spiritual authority and temporal power that define medieval civilization. King John's royal courts claim jurisdiction because adultery violates the king's peace and undermines feudal loyalty between lord and vassal. The church courts insist they have authority because marriage is a sacrament and adultery is a sin requiring ecclesiastical judgment. Meanwhile, Earl William demands the right to handle the matter privately through his own manorial court, because both parties are his vassals, and the offense occurred on his lands. It's like having three different police forces trying to arrest the same criminal while arguing over who has the right to do it. You observe as legal scholars from both sides deploy arguments that would impress modern constitutional lawyers. Church canonists argue that since God created marriage, only God's representatives can judge its violations. Royal lawyers counter that since adultery disrupts social order and potentially affects inheritance and property rights, it falls under secular jurisdiction. Each side cites precedents, papal bulls, royal charters, and ancient customs in a legal arms race that transforms simple adultery into a constitutional crisis. The procedural complications become entertainingly Byzantine as both courts attempt to prosecute simultaneously. Sir Robert finds himself summoned to appear before the local bishop for spiritual judgment, while also being ordered to present himself at the king's court for temporal punishment. Lady Eleanor faces excommunication from church authorities and potential civil prosecution for property crimes. Medieval double jeopardy that makes modern constitutional protections look almost quaint. Here's where the jurisdictional battle gets deliciously complex. Each court system uses different rules of evidence, different standards of proof, and completely different penalties. Church courts rely heavily on confession and spiritual counseling, while royal courts demand witnesses and impose financial penalties. You watch as clever lawyers begin forum shopping, trying to get their cases heard in whichever court offers the most favorable procedures for their clients. But here's the quirky detail that makes medieval legal historians chuckle. Some records suggest that wealthy defendants would deliberately commit minor ecclesiastical offenses to claim benefit of clergy, essentially using religious technicalities to escape secular prosecution. One surviving case involves a nobleman who became a minor religious order member specifically to avoid royal court prosecution for adultery, effectively becoming a monk to escape punishment for sexual misconduct. The evidence gathering creates fascinating conflicts between spiritual and temporal investigative methods. Church investigators rely on confession, spiritual counseling, and community reputation, while royal courts use sworn testimony, physical evidence, and financial records. When the same witnesses testify in both proceedings, they sometimes give completely different accounts, depending on whether they're speaking to priests or royal officials. You witness the development of what medieval lawyers call concurrent jurisdiction, both courts claiming the right to prosecute while theoretically cooperating in the interest of justice. In practice, this creates opportunities for political manipulation, where powerful defendants can play church against state, seeking the most favorable resolution, while less influential parties face prosecution in whichever court offers them the least protection. The punishment phase reveals the deepest contradictions in medieval legal theory. Church penalties emphasize spiritual rehabilitation through penance, pilgrimage, and religious counseling designed to save the sinner's soul. Royal courts focus on social deterrence through fines, imprisonment, and public humiliation, designed to maintain civil order. The same act of adultery might simultaneously require both spiritual purification and civil punishment, essentially being sentenced twice for the same crime. Historians still argue whether the church-state conflict over adultery jurisdiction was primarily theological or political, but the practical result creates a legal system where outcomes depend as much on procedural maneuvering as factual guilt or innocence. Smart lawyers learn to manipulate jurisdictional rules, while ordinary defendants find themselves trapped in bureaucratic competitions between competing authorities. The most innovative aspect of this jurisdictional warfare emerges in the development of appeal procedures and jurisdictional challenges. Medieval lawyers begin creating sophisticated arguments about which court has primary authority based on the defendant's status, the location of the offense, the social rank of the injured parties, and even the specific type of adultery involved, essentially inventing administrative law centuries before modern governments. The case of Sir Robert and Lady Eleanor ultimately gets resolved through a compromise that satisfies no one but demonstrates medieval legal creativity. Church courts handle the spiritual aspects with penance and counseling. Royal courts impose financial penalties and temporary imprisonment. And Earl William gets to arrange a face-saving resolution involving land transfers and marriage rearrangements that restore feudal harmony while maintaining everyone's jurisdictional dignity. You find yourself crouched behind a haystack in a medieval English village around 1350 CE, watching what amounts to grassroots justice in action as the common folk take adultery prosecution into their own hands through methods that would make modern community organizers simultaneously impressed and horrified. The Black Death has just swept through Europe. Traditional authorities are weakened, and peasant communities are developing their own systems of moral enforcement that blend ancient custom with creative improvisation. The target of tonight's community justice is Thomas the miller and Agnes the baker's wife, whose affair has scandalized the village of Little Wickham for months while her husband was away fighting in France. You're about to witness a chivalry, a ritualized community shaming that transforms moral outrage into theatrical performance complete with costumes, music, and enough public humiliation to make reality television look tame. The villagers emerge from their cottages carrying pots, pans, cowbells, and improvised drums, creating a cacophony that can be heard 3 villages away. But this isn't random noise. It's carefully orchestrated community theater, designed to shame the adulterous couple back into proper behavior through public ridicule that's both entertaining and terrifying. You realize you're watching democracy in action, medieval style, where moral enforcement becomes a participatory community event. The procession that forms before you resembles a cross between a religious ceremony and a carnival parade. Village men wear their wives' clothing while women don male garments, creating ritualized gender reversal that symbolically represents the social disorder caused by adultery. Someone has constructed crude effigies of Thomas and Agnes that will be paraded through the streets before being burned or thrown into the village pond. Medieval performance art with serious social consequences. Here's where peasant justice gets creatively vindictive. The community has developed an elaborate system of symbolic punishments that correspond to specific offenses. Adultery involving the baker's wife requires the guilty parties to be pelted with stale bread while riding backwards on donkeys through every street in the village. Affairs involving millers get treated to being covered in flour and forced to operate the mill wheel, while villagers recite mocking verses about their grinding activities. But here's the quirky detail that makes folklore scholars grin. Some villages develop adultery auctions, where community members can bid for the right to impose specific humiliations on the guilty parties. One surviving record from Yorkshire describes a village that raised money for church repairs by auctioning off the privilege of throwing rotten eggs at adulterous couples, essentially turning moral enforcement into fundraising entertainment. You observe the rough music tradition, where villagers create deliberately discordant sounds outside the lovers' homes for consecutive nights, until they either flee the community or publicly confess and seek forgiveness. The musical assault isn't random. Different instruments and rhythms correspond to different types of moral violations, creating a complex symbolic language that communicates specific accusations to anyone familiar with local customs. The ducking stool makes its appearance as the ultimate peasant justice technology, a chair attached to a lever system that allows communities to repeatedly dunk offenders in the village pond, river, or horse trough. The number of dunkings corresponds to the severity of the offense, with adultery typically earning a dozen immersions that serve the dual purpose of physical punishment and spiritual purification through involuntary baptism. Village gossip networks function as both investigation and enforcement mechanisms that would impress modern social media algorithms. You watch as information about suspicious behavior spreads through the community faster than official news, with details becoming increasingly elaborate and dramatic with each retelling. By the time accusations reach the chivalrous stage, the alleged affair has been transformed into an epic tale of seduction, betrayal, and community scandal. The role of village women in adultery enforcement reveals surprising power dynamics in peasant communities. While formal legal systems exclude women from most judicial roles, village justice relies heavily on female networks that monitor domestic behavior, gather evidence, and organize community responses. The wives of Little Wickham essentially function as an informal moral police force with investigative powers that would make professional detectives envious. Historians still argue whether chivalry traditions were primarily about moral enforcement or community entertainment, but the practical result creates effective social control through peer pressure and public humiliation. The threat of becoming the target of village theater is often enough to discourage adultery more effectively than formal legal punishment, especially in communities where reputation determines economic survival and social standing. The seasonal timing of chivalry reveals peasant understanding of agricultural psychology. Most moral enforcement occurs during winter months when communities are confined together and need entertainment to survive the psychological challenges of cold, hunger, and boredom. Adultery prosecution becomes community bonding activity that reinforces social cohesion while providing much-needed diversion from survival pressures. The most sophisticated aspect of peasant justice emerges in its flexibility and community involvement. Unlike rigid legal codes imposed by external authorities, village moral enforcement adapts to local circumstances, individual personalities, and community needs. Each case becomes a negotiation where the severity of punishment reflects not just the offense, but the offender's previous behavior, family connections, and willingness to accept community judgment. The resolution of Thomas and Agnes's case demonstrates peasant legal wisdom in action. After 3 nights of rough music, a public dunking, and ritualized humiliation involving backward donkey rides, they publicly confess their sins, promise to end their affair, and contribute labor to community projects that restore their standing while reinforcing village cohesion through collective work. You find yourself in the lavish chambers of a French duke's castle around 1400 CE, where silk tapestries depicting romantic courtly scenes provide ironic backdrop to a legal proceeding that exposes the breathtaking hypocrisy of medieval justice. Duke Charles de Burgundy reclines on velvet cushions while his court considers adultery charges that would send a peasant to the ducking stool, but might earn a nobleman nothing more than a politely worded suggestion to be more discreet about his extramarital adventures. The case before you involves Duke Charles himself, accused of conducting simultaneous affairs with his chancellor's wife, his stable master's daughter, and possibly a visiting abbess whose spiritual devotion apparently extends beyond prayer and fasting. Under normal circumstances, such accusations would result in severe punishment, but you're about to witness how medieval law bends like a sapling in strong wind when confronted with sufficient noble privilege and political necessity. The Duke's legal team, educated at the University of Paris and skilled in both canon law and royal legislation, has constructed a defense that would make modern corporate lawyers applaud. They argue that noble adultery serves different social functions than commoner infidelity. When aristocrats engage in extramarital relations, they're actually strengthening political alliances, demonstrating virility essential for military leadership, and following ancient precedents set by biblical kings and classical heroes. Here's where aristocratic privilege gets entertainingly creative. The court accepts testimony that Duke Charles's affairs are actually diplomatic necessities. His relationship with the chancellor's wife allegedly secures important political intelligence, while his seduction of the stable master's daughter demonstrates his connection to common folk essential for maintaining feudal loyalty. Even the abbess affair gets reframed as spiritual counseling that requires intimate personal contact to be truly effective. You observe as the legal proceedings transform from adultery prosecution into something resembling a diplomatic conference. Rather than examining evidence of sexual misconduct, the court considers whether the Duke's relationships serve broader political purposes that outweigh traditional moral concerns. It's like watching justice get redesigned in real time to accommodate the convenience of powerful defendants. But here's the quirky detail that makes medieval historians shake their heads. Some noble courts develop elaborate protocols for honorable adultery that essentially legalize extramarital affairs, provided they follow proper aristocratic procedures. One surviving manuscript from the court of Avignon describes formal rules for noble seduction, including required waiting periods, appropriate gift-giving, and even standardized love letters that demonstrate the affair follows courtly rather than vulgar patterns. The contrast with peasant justice becomes starkly obvious when you witness a parallel case being heard in the castle's lower court. William the blacksmith, accused of kissing the miller's wife behind the church after Sunday Mass, faces public flogging, substantial fines, and potential banishment from the duchy. His crime involves less physical contact than the Duke enjoys daily, but his lack of noble blood makes him subject to the full severity of moral law that apparently doesn't apply to his social superiors. Medieval double standards reach artistic peaks in the punishment phase. Duke Charles receives what court records delicately describe as spiritual counsel and noble penance, essentially a private conversation with a friendly bishop who suggests the Duke might consider being more circumspect about his relationships to avoid scandal that could damage the duchy's reputation. Meanwhile, William the blacksmith gets tied to a cart and whipped through every village between the castle and the county border. The legal justification for this disparity reveals sophisticated thinking about social hierarchy and divine order. Noble legal scholars argue that aristocrats operate under different moral standards because they bear greater responsibilities for political stability, military defense, and social leadership. Just as nobles eat finer food and wear better clothes, they're entitled to different standards of sexual behavior that reflect their elevated position in the cosmic hierarchy established by God. You witness the development of what historians call scandal management procedures designed to protect noble reputations while maintaining the fiction of moral consistency. When Duke Charles's affairs become too public to ignore, his court arranges elaborate cover stories involving political missions, hunting expeditions, and religious retreats that provide plausible explanations for his presence in various ladies' bedchambers. Historians still argue whether medieval noble privilege in adultery cases reflected genuine belief in aristocratic moral superiority or simply practical recognition that powerful defendants required different treatment. But the result creates a legal system where identical behavior receives vastly different consequences based entirely on social status. The most cynical aspect of noble adultery law emerges in its treatment of evidence and testimony. Courts readily accept hearsay, rumors, and circumstantial evidence when prosecuting commoners, but demand impossibly high standards of proof when dealing with aristocratic defendants. Noble witnesses somehow develop convenient memory problems, physical evidence disappears, and accusers discover urgent business in distant territories that prevents their testimony. The economic implications of this double standard extend beyond individual cases to affect entire communities. When nobles face minimal consequences for adultery, they have little incentive to maintain stable marriages, leading to inheritance disputes, political instability, and social disruption that affects everyone from peasant farmers to international merchants who depend on consistent governance for trade security. The ultimate resolution of Duke Charles's case demonstrates medieval realpolitik at its finest. He agrees to make generous donations to several monasteries, arranges advantageous marriages for his illegitimate children, and promises to conduct future affairs with greater discretion, essentially purchasing moral absolution through strategic charity and diplomatic marriage arrangements that actually strengthen his political position. You find yourself transported to a medieval convent around 1250 CE, where Sister Marguerite sits in a cold stone cell, her fate hanging in the balance not because of what she's done, but because of her gender in a legal system that treats women's adultery as fundamentally different, and far more dangerous, than men's. The irony isn't lost on you that in a world where women have virtually no legal rights, they somehow bear almost complete responsibility for maintaining sexual morality. The legal proceedings you observe reveal the medieval mind's fascinating contradictions about female nature. women are simultaneously considered too weak and irrational to make important decisions about property, politics, or even their own marriages, yet somehow cunning and powerful enough to seduce virtuous men into sin through their dangerous sexuality. It's like being declared incompetent and criminally mastermind simultaneously. Canon law has created what amounts to a separate legal system for women that would make modern civil rights lawyers reach for their litigation briefcases. While men accused of adultery might face fines, temporary imprisonment, or social embarrassment, women face accusations that strike at the very core of their economic survival and social existence. An adulterous woman doesn't just lose her marriage, she loses her legal identity, property rights, and often her children. The case of Sister Marguerite demonstrates how women navigate these impossible legal waters through strategies that blend desperation with remarkable creativity. Before taking religious vows, she was Lady Marguerite de Montclair, accused of adultery by her husband, who conveniently wanted to remarry for political advantage. Rather than face certain conviction in secular court, she claimed a religious calling and entered the convent, essentially using God as her divorce lawyer. Here's where women's legal status gets bewilderingly complex. Marriage creates what legal scholars call coverture, where a woman's legal identity becomes subsumed into her husband's. She can't own property, make contracts, or even testify in court without his permission. But paradoxically, adultery accusations can restore some legal agency by forcing courts to treat her as an independent actor capable of making decisions about her own sexual behavior. But here's the quirky detail that makes feminist historians both laugh and cry. Some medieval women develop elaborate strategies for manipulating adultery laws to escape unwanted marriages. Court records describe wives who stage fake affairs with cooperative male friends, essentially using adultery accusations as medieval divorce proceedings. One particularly creative case involves a woman who allegedly seduced her own husband while he was disguised as someone else, creating legal confusion about whether she had committed adultery with herself. The evidence standards for prosecuting women reveal deep anxieties about female sexuality that border on the pathological. Courts accept testimony about women's adultery based on evidence that wouldn't convict a man of theft. Suspicious glances, unexplained gifts, changes in dress or behavior, or even accusations from rejected suitors seeking revenge. You realize you're watching legal systems designed by men terrified of female sexuality they can't control. Women's responses to these impossible legal situations demonstrate remarkable ingenuity within severe constraints. Some develop networks of female allies who provide alibis, hide evidence, and coordinate testimony to protect each other from adultery accusations. Others use religious institutions as sanctuary, claiming spiritual callings that remove them from secular marriage law. The most desperate resort to accusations of rape or witchcraft against their accusers, essentially weaponizing other forms of medieval misogyny for self-protection. The property implications of women's adultery cases reveal the economic motivations often hidden behind moral rhetoric. When Lady Eleanor faces adultery charges, you observe that her husband's real concern isn't moral outrage, but legal control over her substantial dowry and inheritance rights. Adultery conviction would transfer her wealth to him, while freeing him to remarry for additional political advantage. Moral law as economic warfare. Medieval divorce law creates particularly cruel paradoxes for women facing adultery accusations. The Church considers marriage indissoluble, so even women married to abusive or abandoning husbands cannot remarry without committing adultery if their husbands are still alive. But men can often obtain annulments through political pressure or creative legal arguments about consanguinity, spiritual impediments, or pre-existing contracts that weren't available to their wives. Historians still argue whether medieval women's strategies for navigating adultery law represent genuine agency or simply desperate survival tactics within oppressive systems. But the court records reveal sophisticated understanding of legal loopholes and procedural manipulation that suggests women were far from passive victims of patriarchal justice. The most innovative aspect of women's legal resistance emerges in their use of religious institutions and spiritual authority to challenge secular adultery prosecutions. By claiming divine calling, miraculous intervention, or prophetic visions, some women successfully reframe their cases from criminal prosecution to religious controversy, essentially forcing male authorities to choose between legal consistency and spiritual authority. The international variations in women's legal status create opportunities for legal forum shopping that sophisticated medieval women learned to exploit. A woman facing adultery charges in England might flee to territories with different legal traditions, claim sanctuary in foreign religious institutions, or even marry into families with international connections that provide legal protection through diplomatic immunity. The case of Sister Marguerite ultimately demonstrates both the constraints and possibilities available to medieval women. While she loses her secular identity and family connections by entering religious life, she gains legal protection from adultery prosecution, educational opportunities unavailable to married women, and spiritual authority that allows her to influence community affairs in ways that would have been impossible as a wife subject to coverture law. You find yourself standing in the town square of medieval Regensburg around 1320 CE, where the morning air fills with anticipation as townsfolk gather for what amounts to medieval reality television. The public punishment of Hans the butcher and Greta the seamstress, whose adultery has provided the community with months of gossip, and is about to culminate in a spectacle that transforms justice into entertainment and moral instruction into theatrical performance. The creativity of medieval punishment reaches artistic heights that would make modern performance artists envious. You watch as the town executioner, who doubles as master of ceremonies, explains to the gathered crowd how today's proceedings will demonstrate divine justice while providing educational entertainment for the entire family. It's like watching the birth of infotainment, except the stakes are someone's actual dignity and social survival. The punishment begins with what medieval authorities call graduated humiliation, a carefully choreographed series of increasingly embarrassing penalties designed to maximize both deterrent effect and crowd satisfaction. Hans and Greta are first required to wear distinctive clothing that identifies their crime. Bright yellow garments with red letters spelling adulterium, sewn across the chest and back, essentially turning them into walking moral billboards for the next several months. Here's where medieval justice gets theatrically elaborate. The couple must participate in a public procession through every street in town while carrying signs describing their offense in both Latin and vernacular German. But the procession isn't just walking. They're required to stop at designated locations and recite specific confessions, prayers, and apologies while townspeople are encouraged to offer commentary, advice, and the occasional rotten vegetable. The pillory makes its dramatic entrance as the centerpiece of public shaming technology. You observe as Hans gets locked into the wooden restraints that hold his head and hands immobile while allowing maximum public access for verbal abuse, symbolic pelting, and moral instruction. Medieval engineering has created a device that's simultaneously punishment machine and community bonding experience, where justice becomes participatory entertainment. But here's the quirky detail that makes historians of punishment grin. Some towns develop elaborate shame competitions, where different neighborhoods compete to create the most creative insults, symbolic punishments, or moral lessons for the pillory-bound offenders. One surviving record from Nuremberg describes a contest where guild members took turns delivering rhyming moral lectures to adulterous couples, with prizes awarded for the most eloquent combination of humor, instruction, and humiliation. The ducking stool returns as the grand finale of aquatic justice, but you discover that different regions have developed distinctive variations that reflect local geography and cultural creativity. Coastal towns use tidal pools that provide natural timing for repeated immersions, while mountain communities employ mill wheels that create mechanical dunking systems powered by water flow. It's engineering applied to moral correction with results that are both effective and deeply memorable. Medieval authorities understand the psychological principles that modern advertising executives would recognize. Public humiliation works best when it's memorable, repeatable, and socially reinforced. The punishments you witness are designed to create lasting community memories that will be recalled whenever anyone considers similar behavior, essentially turning individual punishment into collective deterrence through shared traumatic entertainment. The role of children in these proceedings reveals medieval thinking about moral education that would horrify modern child psychologists. Parents bring their offspring to witness public punishments as instructional experiences, explaining the consequences of adultery, while children throw flowers, sing songs, and participate in ritualized shaming that's presented as both entertainment and moral education. It's like taking your kids to a theme park where the rides involve real human suffering. You notice how punishment spectacles serve multiple social functions beyond simple deterrence. They provide community entertainment during periods when professional performers are rare and expensive, create opportunities for public moral instruction that reinforces religious and social values, and offer legitimate outlets for community tensions and frustrations that might otherwise explode into more destructive violence. The economic aspects of public punishment reveal medieval entrepreneurship at its most creative. Local vendors sell food, drinks, and souvenirs to punishment spectators, while enterprising citizens rent elevated seating or premium viewing locations for particularly notorious cases. You realize you're watching the commodification of justice, where moral correction becomes economic opportunity for savvy medieval business people. Historians still argue whether medieval public punishments were primarily about deterrence, entertainment, or social control, but the elaborate staging and community participation suggest all three motivations working simultaneously to create events that serve multiple social needs while maintaining the fiction of pure moral instruction. The most psychologically sophisticated aspect of medieval punishment emerges in its use of ritual reversal and symbolic inversion. Adulterers who violated proper sexual order face punishments that deliberately reverse normal social relationships. Respected community members become objects of ridicule. Private behavior becomes public spectacle, and individual shame becomes collective entertainment. The aftermath of Hans and Greta's punishment demonstrates the long-term social consequences of public shaming. While the immediate physical penalties end within hours, the social stigma will follow them for years, affecting their economic opportunities, marriage prospects, and community, standing in ways that make the public humiliation just the beginning of their real punishment. The artistic creativity reaches its peak when the town commissioned commemorative artwork depicting the punishment. Murals, woodcuts, and even dramatic performances that will preserve the memory of Hans and Greta's downfall for future generations, essentially immortalizing their shame as moral instruction that outlasts their natural lives. You find yourself standing at the crossroads of medieval Europe around 1400 CE, where trade routes carry more than silk, spices, and precious metals. They're spreading legal ideas about adultery that create a fascinating patchwork of regional variations, cultural exchanges, and hybrid legal systems that would make comparative law scholars dizzy with excitement. A Venetian merchant's adultery trial in Hamburg operates under completely different rules than the same offense would face in Naples, creating opportunities for legal tourism that sophisticated medieval defendants learn to exploit. The Hanseatic League's Northern Trading Network has created what amounts to a legal laboratory where Germanic, Scandinavian, and Slavic approaches to adultery prosecution blend in ways that reflect commercial practicality over theoretical consistency. You observe a case involving a Norwegian trader accused of seducing the wife of a Danish guild master while conducting business in Lübeck, a scenario that requires courts to navigate three different legal traditions while maintaining diplomatic relations essential for continued trade. Venice has developed perhaps Europe's most sophisticated approach to international adultery cases, treating them as diplomatic incidents requiring careful negotiation between competing legal authorities. When Ser Marco Dandolo, a prominent Venetian glass merchant, faces adultery charges in Constantinople involving the wife of a Byzantine silk trader, the Doge's legal advisors treat the case as a matter of international relations that could affect trade privileges throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's where cultural exchange gets legally fascinating. Islamic legal principles about evidence and testimony begin influencing European courts through Spain and Sicily, while Byzantine legal traditions spread through Italian maritime trading networks. You watch as a French court considers whether to adopt Islamic four-witness requirements for adultery prosecution, attracted by the system's reputation for preventing false accusations that could disrupt valuable commercial relationships. But here's the quirky detail that makes legal anthropologists chuckle. Some trading centers develop merchant law versions of adultery prosecution, specifically designed for international business communities. These streamlined procedures focus on financial compensation and commercial reputation rather than moral punishment, essentially treating adultery as a breach of contract that requires economic rather than spiritual resolution. The Silk Road's eastern terminus brings even more exotic legal influences into European thinking about adultery. Mongol legal traditions emphasizing practical resolution over moral punishment influence courts from Kiev to Krakow, while Chinese concepts about family honor and social harmony spread through trading communities that value stability over strict justice. You realize you're watching legal globalization happening centuries before anyone invented the term. Regional specialization emerges as different areas develop reputations for particular approaches to adultery law that attract specific types of cases. Italian city-states become known for sophisticated legal procedures that favor wealthy defendants, while German imperial courts develop reputations for harsh but consistent punishment that appeals to plaintiffs seeking definitive justice. It's like medieval forum shopping, where legal outcomes depend as much on geography as evidence. The influence of pilgrimage routes creates another layer of legal complexity as religious travelers carry both accusations and legal precedents across international boundaries. When English pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela commit adultery in French territory, their cases must navigate not just secular and ecclesiastical authority, but also the special legal privileges granted to religious travelers by international treaty. You witness the emergence of what legal historians call hybrid courts, that blend different legal traditions to handle complex international cases. A Flemish merchant accused of adultery in Seville faces judgment from a tribunal that applies Roman law principles, Islamic evidence requirements, local Castilian customs, and church canon law, creating legal procedures that would confuse even the judges implementing them. The most innovative development emerges in trading centers like Bruges, Constantinople, and Alexandria, where international commercial communities develop their own informal legal systems for handling adultery cases that might disrupt essential business relationships. These merchant tribunals emphasize discretion, compensation, and practical resolution over the theatrical public punishments favored by purely local courts. Historians still argue whether medieval legal diversity in adultery cases reflected genuine cultural differences or simply practical adaptations to local political conditions. But the result creates a European legal landscape where identical behavior might result in execution, financial penalty, religious penance, or complete absolution, depending on where the case gets prosecuted. The documentation of these regional variations creates the first comparative legal studies as scholars begin systematically recording different approaches to adultery law across various jurisdictions. University-trained lawyers develop expertise in multiple legal systems, essentially becoming medieval legal consultants who can advise clients on optimal venues for prosecution or defense. The influence of military campaigns creates another vector for legal exchange as armies carry legal precedents and procedures across international boundaries. Crusading knights bring Eastern legal concepts back to Western Europe, while the Hundred Years' War spreads English common law principles throughout French territories and vice versa, creating hybrid legal systems that reflect military as well as commercial contact. The most sophisticated aspect of this legal exchange emerges in the development of international legal principles that transcend local customs. Treaties between trading partners begin including provisions for handling adultery cases involving foreign nationals, creating early forms of international law that prioritize diplomatic relations over strict moral enforcement. The case studies you observe reveal how legal systems adapt and evolve through cultural contact, with successful innovations spreading through trading networks while impractical procedures get abandoned in favor of approaches that better serve international commercial communities that depend on predictable, efficient justice rather than elaborate moral theater. You find yourself transported to a modern courtroom in 2024. Where the ghost of medieval adultery law haunts contemporary legal proceedings in ways that would astonish both ancient legislators and modern defendants. The judge's gavel echoes with centuries of legal evolution as you witness how concepts forged in Germanic longhouses, Roman forums, and church councils continue to shape how modern societies handle the intimate complexities of marriage, betrayal, and justice. The DNA evidence being presented in today's paternity case connects directly to medieval concerns about legitimate inheritance that drove adultery prosecution for over 1,000 years. While modern courts use scientific testing instead of trial by ordeal, the underlying legal question remains identical, determining biological parentage to resolve property rights and family obligations. You realize you're watching the same fundamental human dramas, played out with more sophisticated technology, but essentially unchanged legal principles. Modern divorce law reveals its medieval ancestry in surprising ways. The concept of fault-based divorce that still exists in many jurisdictions directly descends from ecclesiastical courts that required proof of moral failure to dissolve marriages. When a contemporary spouse cites adultery as grounds for divorce, they're invoking legal principles that medieval canon lawyers would instantly recognize, even if the procedures now involve private investigators instead of confession and community testimony. Here's where medieval influence gets fascinatingly persistent. Modern alienation of affection lawsuits allow spouses to sue their partner's lover for damaging the marriage, essentially reviving the ancient Germanic concept of compensation for honor violations. Courts in North Carolina, Hawaii, and other jurisdictions still award damages for emotional harm caused by adultery, creating financial consequences that echo medieval Wergild calculations designed to restore social balance through monetary payment. But here's the quirky detail that demonstrates legal continuity across centuries. Some modern prenuptial agreements include specific financial penalties for adultery that mirror medieval compensation schemes. Wealthy couples essentially create private legal systems that impose contractual consequences for marital betrayal, turning adultery back into the economic calculation that medieval law always recognized it to be. The persistence of adultery as a criminal offense in some jurisdictions reveals how slowly legal systems abandon ancient moral categories. Military courts still prosecute adultery under provisions that trace directly back to medieval concerns about honor, loyalty, and unit cohesion that would make Viking warriors nod with approval. The same behavior that might result in civil consequences in civilian courts can trigger criminal prosecution for military personnel, creating dual legal standards that echo medieval distinctions between different social classes. Modern custody law demonstrates perhaps the most direct connection to medieval legal thinking. Courts still consider parental moral fitness when determining child custody arrangements, essentially applying medieval concepts about character and social standing to contemporary family disputes. A parent's adultery can influence custody decisions in ways that directly descend from medieval beliefs about the connection between sexual morality and general trustworthiness. You observe how modern legal systems struggle with the same fundamental tensions that challenged medieval courts, balancing individual privacy against community interest, weighing moral considerations against practical consequences, and determining appropriate punishment for behavior that harms relationships without necessarily violating other people's rights. The legal questions haven't changed, only the procedures and penalties have evolved. The international aspect of modern adultery law reveals continued regional variation that would be familiar to medieval merchants navigating different legal systems across European trading routes. Adultery remains a capital offense in some countries while being completely decriminalized in others, creating opportunities for legal forum shopping that sophisticated modern defendants exploit just as their medieval predecessors did. Modern technology creates new applications for ancient legal principles as courts wrestle with digital adultery evidence that medieval investigators could never have imagined. Text messages, email records, social media posts, and GPS tracking provide the kind of detailed evidence that medieval courts demanded but rarely obtained, essentially fulfilling ancient desires for comprehensive proof while raising new questions about privacy and surveillance that medieval legal systems never considered. Historians still argue whether the persistence of medieval legal concepts in modern adultery law represents cultural continuity, or simply the practical reality that human nature creates similar legal problems across centuries. But the connections are undeniable in everything from contemporary criminal statutes to international treaty provisions about marriage and family law. The therapeutic approach that characterizes modern family law reflects medieval church innovations in treating adultery as spiritual failure requiring counseling and rehabilitation, rather than simple punishment. Modern marriage counseling, mediation services, and family therapy essentially continue ecclesiastical traditions of addressing adultery through guided self-examination and behavioral change rather than purely punitive measures. As you witness contemporary legal proceedings that blend scientific evidence with ancient moral categories, procedural innovations with traditional social values, you realize that medieval adultery law hasn't disappeared. It has evolved, adapted, and integrated itself so thoroughly into modern legal systems that we barely recognize its continued influence on how societies attempt to regulate the eternal human drama of love, betrayal, and the consequences of both. The cases unfolding before you in modern courtrooms prove that while technology, social attitudes, and legal procedures have transformed dramatically over the centuries, the fundamental challenge of creating fair, effective, and socially beneficial responses to adultery remains as complex and contentious today as it was when Hammurabi first ordered unfaithful couples to be cast into the Euphrates River nearly 4,000 years ago. The soft glow of streetlights filters through courtroom windows as modern legal proceedings wind down for another day, much like candlelight once flickered in medieval halls where similar human dramas played out with different costumes but identical emotions. You've traveled through centuries of legal evolution, witnessing how societies across time and geography have wrestled with the same fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and the price of betrayal that continue to challenge us today. The gentle hum of air conditioning replaces the crackling of ancient hearth fires, but the echoes of medieval wisdom still whisper through contemporary corridors of justice. From Babylonian riverside judgments to modern family courts, the thread of human nature weaves continuously through legal systems that rise and fall like tides, each generation convinced they've discovered new solutions to problems as old as marriage itself. As these final words drift into the quiet darkness of your evening, let the weight of centuries settle softly around you like a familiar blanket, knowing that tomorrow's headlines will contain stories that medieval chroniclers would recognize immediately. Proof that some aspects of human experience remain beautifully, frustratingly, eternally unchanged. The gavel falls one last time. Court adjourns, and the ancient dance between love and law continues its endless waltz through time.